My presentation would be presentation about some reflection I had in the last few years about the learning process in psychological terms. In a very simple, maybe simplistic way, we can think of learning as getting from an input to a memory representation of that input. So input could be the numbers from 1 to whatever. It could be the alphabet. It could be learning how to drive a bicycle. And the resulting product would be a memory representation of that event. There are several constraints in that process. The process is not simple, and the constraints pertain mostly at the input level, that is to say, we have limits on coding of information. Not all information we are presented with are coded into memory. Some information, the information that is the focus of attention, are more likely to be to result in a memory representation than information that is outside the focus of attention. We have input which are external, visual, audio representation, that they are in the world, but we also have internal inputs. So we may learn something not just because it's outside, but because we make inferences process on information that we have already obtained. So we have internal, and of course we have information which is very clear, very available, information which is degraded in many ways. And you may think of this as an interesting situation, because you may think that clear information are learned more easily, but sometimes a degraded input forces you to pay more attention, to devote more resources, and so you learn more about a degraded input rather than a clear input. And then we have the memory front about this learning process, and I would like you to appreciate the fact that memory is not a let's say, perfect representation of what we know. Memory is reconstructive. We reconstruct information in our memory. It's not really a photograph of what we see, but it's something that we operate on. It's flexible, and so sometimes we may remember things that we have learned, sometimes we are not able to remember things that we have learned, and is sometimes inaccurate, so that we think we remember something that was there but was not there, and vice versa. So, a complex process, and just to give you an idea, at the coding level, perception, the coding process, as a cognitive process, is supposed to be universal. Everybody, apart from expected individual differences, everybody should perceive things in the same way. However, Nisbet and Miyamoto have reviewed mechanisms underlying cultural differences in perception, so not really individual, but respect to the cultural background, indicating that participants in different social practice, participants of different people of different cultures, leads to both chronic as well as temporary shift in perception. And I would like to give you an example, but for the sake of time, we'll go on, But what I would like to draw your attention to is that this finding establishes a dynamic relationship between the cultural context and perceptual process. As for memory, I'll give you this example just to underline the flexibility of the system. If you learn about a house from the perspective of a buyer, you remember, at least partially, different things that if you learn about the same house from a perspective of a burglar. So people were asked to read a text from the perspective of the buyer or the perspective of the burglar. The interesting thing is that after you have recalled the text from the perspective of a buyer, for example, they ask people to change the perspective and say, okay, now please recall the same text, thinking that you are a burglar, you are a thief. And in this situation, people remember about 7% of things that were unrecalled in the first case. So information was there, it was learned, but people did not recall it on the first instance because the perspective they were taking in some way influenced recall. So I think we can, conclude, at least temporarily, that learning is based both on conscious and unconscious processing. Both type of processes goes on at the same time, and memory is only indirectly indexing our learning process. Is not an accurate reflection of learning, even though it is an index that is often used to index learning. Based on my observation, I thought that we may characterize learning on the basis of the linearity principle. That is to say, if two inputs are of the same kind, they should show similar learning trajectories. On the contrary, if two inputs are different in kinds, then we should expect them to show different learning trajectories. Especially the second one is, is really an assumption, but if we characterize the relationship, learning as a relationship between an input and a memory representation, then if the input is different, we should expect the memory representation to be different. Now, I'd like to show you 3 cases of possible inconsistency with the linearity principle. The first case is the study by Osterhout and his colleagues, and they studied the learning of a second language by people who did not know the language at all. So they were very introductory courses. They were American participants learning French in the States, in America. They went to classes, 2 or 3 classes per week, and at regular interval during the learning period, they were tested on sentences which were well-formed sentences or they had some anomalies. We will see what type of anomalies they were. And the first test was 1 month after the start of the course. So about 12 classes about French. And the measure this author used was evoked potent responses, ERPs. ERPs is an electrophysiological measure of the dynamics of the brain responses to some input. So This is interesting because usually there are behavioral measures of learning, but this is really how the brain changes as a function of learning. And usually there is there are several, but there are two main waveforms associated to language processing. One is N400, which is a negativity after about 400 milliseconds from the presentation of the input, and is associated with semantic anomalies. The other one is the P600, the positivity, about 600 milliseconds after the presentation of the input, which is associated with syntactic anomalies. The type of sentences that, anomalous sentences that Osterhout et al. Use is of this kind, a semantic condition, semantic anomaly. The cat will bake the food. Cats cannot bake food. And syntactic, in this case, a wrong tense, verb tense condition, the cat will eat in the food, which is not correct. Native speaker, French native speaker, showed an N400 for semantic anomalous words and a P600 for the syntactic anomalies. What about learners of French, American people learning French at the beginning? Well, there were big individual differences, and the author identified fast learners and slow learners. And what we will present here is only the data about the fast learners. So people who really learned very easily or quite easily French. For semantic errors, they showed an N400, just like native speaker. And this is just after 1 month of instruction. So the mental representation, they really learn the language. The mental representation is there. And the fact to notice is that this N400 effect changed very little with further learning. What happened with syntactic errors? Well, in this case, the learner's brain discriminated between well-formed sentences and anomalous sentences. However, rather than having a P600 effect like in native speakers, we show a 400, an N400-like effect. So here, L2 learners behave differently from native speakers. After 4 months of learning, also L2 learners showed a P600 effect, just like native speaker. Okay? So the situation here is that either a possible non-specific response to something that is unexpected. There is an error, and so an N400 will come out. And this would still be compatible with the linearity principle. Alternatively, the N400 is an ad hoc responses for L2 learners that will evolve into a full consistent response as learning progress. And this explanation will indicate a violation of the linearity principle, as different kind of input, semantic and syntactic, will map into the same learning trajectory. It is difficult to decide between these two alternatives. However, we should underline that the N400 was very similar for L2 and native speakers, so it seems rather difficult to say that it was an ad hoc strategy. It did change minimally over time, and several data show that semantic anomalies are detected with higher probability than syntactic anomalies. I don't have time to go into the problem if it is a strategic effect. We may come back if you are interested during the questions. The second type of violation of the linearity principle I want to show is a study that we did with Chinese participant learning English. Okay? So we asked participants to learn, Chinese participants to learn English over an 8 weeks period. There was an experimental group which used a bicycle during learning, so they were on a bicycle and they were pedaling, and the words were presented to them during this period. While for the control group, we had the usual sedentary situation. They were sitting on a table and they were looking at the same place and the words were presented to them. And we were interested to see if the movement, the motion, could give an advantage in learning the vocabulary, the foreign vocabulary. We used 40 words paired with the corresponding pictures, and we presented each picture with the written name as well as the spoken name for 5 minutes. We had 3 repetitions in each session, and there was 8 sessions held 1 week apart from each other. The learning data were, again, the word picture association. We showed, I will show you now, pairs of pictures and words, and asked participants if they were correct, the correct picture was paired with the word or not. But we also had a sentence judgment task. We made up very simple sentence, a subject, a verb, and an object. And we asked if the sentence had a meaning, or if it was meaningful, or it was meaningless. Just to illustrate, for the word picture verification, we presented the word, for example, magnifier, with the picture of the magnifiers, and participants said yes. Okay? Yes means that they have learned the relationship between the two. Also, we presented flower and eyeglasses, and of course, if they have learned the meaning of flower, they should have said no about this pair. For the sentence semantic judgment, we presented semantically anomalous sentences like the stone eats the magnifier. Of course, stones do not eat anything. And we had other sentences like the doctor hides the eyeglasses, which make perfect sense. Very easily the result, the experimental group was always better than the, did I say experimental group? Yes, was always better than the control group in the word picture verification time since the first session. Okay, so from the very beginning, people who bicycled were much better than people who did not bicycle. However, for the sentence semantic judgment, this better performance of the experimental group appeared only on the 5th session. So for the first 4 sessions, there was no benefit for the group, in spite of their better performance in the picture word verification. So they learned the words better, they had a bigger vocabulary, they could remember the words better, but they were not able to put their performance on words into sentences. Now, this is something that I'd like to interpret as having the same vocabulary giving rise to two different trajectories. The words were the same, however, dynamic learning showed an early effect at the lexical level, but later effects at the sentence level. We may think that the two tasks make different demands on the system. Maybe for the word recall, there was only recall, while the sentence also required a decision. Or it could be that the lexical level is easier than the sentence level. However, whatever the reason, this pattern contrasts with the linearity principle. The last case I'd like to present you with is a situation where people refer to the same set of input, so to the same input, to the same set of information, with two different types of reasoning, a scientific reasoning or an intuitive reasoning. So Schutterman and Vaccarel documented a long-term conflict between science and intuition in 10 knowledge domains. They asked people about astronomy, genetics, mechanics, specific aspects. And this conflict concerned the vast majority of the items. So for about 90% of the items, there was a conflict between the two, the scientific and the intuitive type. So the conflict concerned both statements that are scientifically true but intuitively false, like air is composed of matter, but also the other way, that is scientifically false but intuitively true, fire is composed of matter, or human descent from chimpanzee. Okay? So, we have the study I want to report very briefly. We have a situation where young adults, humanity professors, and science professors were given statements that could be interpreted from an intuitive point of view or a scientific point of view. They asked to say, is this statement true or false? So a simple decision, true, false. And the dependent variables was the percent correct and response times, how long it takes to make the decision, to reach the decision. There were 200 statements, and you can see here that some of the statements were true both from an intuitive and a scientific point of view. One fourth was false on both intuitive and scientific theories, and the remaining were half true on intuitive theories but false on scientific theories, and the last fourth was false on intuitive theories but true on scientific theories. Very briefly, the result, when the true where statements were consistent scientifically and intuitively, then the performance is better. It's not perfect, it's not 100%, but it's much better. As you would expect, professors perform better than non-professors, younger adults. It should be expected on several, grounds. But interestingly, when the items were inconsistent, performance went down. People really had a very, sometimes very low, around 50% is 0.6, performance on statements that were inconsistent between scientific and intuitive reasoning. We may conclude that participants, independently from the science expertise they had acquired, verify scientific statements that were inconsistent with intuition significantly slower and less accurately than they verify scientific statements that were consistent with intuition. Thus, scientific explanation and intuitive explanation coexist in the participant minds, delaying decision on inconsistent items. This is a peculiar violation of the linearity principle, since the input is actually the same, but it corresponds to two memory representations, which coexist. One would expect that once the scientific explanation is mastered, the intuitive explanation will go away. One would expect not a coexistence of two different memory representations for the same object. Interestingly, intuitive accounts of phenomena correlate with low systematizing, poor physics skills and mechanical abilities, and with a tendency to assign mentality to non-mental phenomena. For example, the house remembers its history, or trees can think, applying mental attributes to non-mental phenomena. And they are also associated with supernatural beliefs. And here, I would like to make a reference to our first presentation today, in which Professor Murasse was talking about spirituality. It's really interesting because spirituality is a very important feature of humans, and maybe not only of humans, a tendency toward some balance between self and the universe. But there is also this tendency for at least some part of the population to invest in supernatural beliefs which may have inconsistent roots into science. It's not two separate systems, it's just they are not consistent. This pattern seems to point out that the intuitive and scientific learning map to different memory representations that coexist in the same person. Just to conclude, I have presented three cases that, in my opinion, represent deviation from the linearity principle. Now, I would like to stress that there is nothing wrong in nonlinearity. It's not worse or better than linearity. However, it signals that two inputs that are of the same kind may actually map to two different memory representations and vice versa. The different input may map into the same or similar representation. I think the pattern has implication for both theories as well as application relating to the human mind. We should probably not take for granted that the learning process will end up in a fallacious, linear, continuous way, but there will be drawback, there will be different situation and situation of relative ambiguity. Very light slide from a methodological and an epistemological point of view, investigating a cognitive process at different levels, that is neural, functional, behavioral, social, allows for a fine-grained analysis, so that we should not really limit ourselves to only one level of analysis, because we may miss important information. And this also applies to the approaches offered by different scientific areas, as each may shed light on specific aspects and may provide relevant, detailed, and independent evidence. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much.